From exotic class items to motes of light, here are 70 things only Destiny veterans remember. And to start off this nostalgic journey, for number 1 we have the classic loading screen and original music. Of course, veteran players will also remember the other cool loading screens we've had over the years, but none of them are quite as special as the original. The special and heavy ammo synthesis were consumable items that will definitely stand out to anyone who played Destiny 1. Upon consumption, these items would instantly refill your heavy or special ammo reserves. Back in Destiny 1, there was actually not a mantle mechanic to help you land your jump on a new surface. We might take this for granted nowadays, but the lack of this mechanic led to millions of misadventures over the years. The original tower is one of the things veteran players miss the most from Destiny 1. Especially when there were special events going on, this version of the tower really just hit different. We do get to see it a little bit in the final shape, but it will never be quite the same as the real social space from back in the day. Class-exclusive weapons like Ace of Spades, Fabian Strategy, and Tlaloc were pretty notable exotics from Destiny 1. That's right, Ace of Spades used to be a class-exclusive exotic that could only be used by hunters. There were also some class-exclusive legendary weapons you might remember, like the Susanoo Fusion Rifle, a Mobius Shotgun, and Stillpiercer Sniper Rifle. There used to be these little orange icons on the map that would lead you to side missions called adventures. These were basically used to fill in gaps in the story and explain lore that wasn't really mentioned anywhere else. Even though all of these adventures were completely deleted from the game in 2020, there was a bug that sometimes still informed players that a new adventure was available. Cade's Stash is a pretty iconic mission from the Taken King, where players traveled all the way to the top of one of the spaceships in the Cosmodrome, but it also contained a little surprise in the form of a Taken Phalanx. If you've played Destiny in the past few years, you might be familiar with these guys. You know, the ones that send you flying backward with their shield ability. Well, since players didn't know about this at the time, many people were in for a surprise when they encountered their first Taken Phalanx on this mission. Traveler's Chosen Damaged was a zero-power sidearm obtained from the Red War version of the Destiny 2 introduction campaign. Some players still even have this weapon as a memento because that campaign has been removed, making this weapon no longer obtainable. In early Destiny 1, the planetary materials called Relic Iron, Spin Metal, Helium Filaments, and Spirit Bloom were actually incredibly valuable. Weapons would not come with their perks unlocked by default, so you would first need to level them up by grinding experience, and then you would get this upgrade unlocked notification. Following this notification, you would still need to pay a sizable amount of planetary materials to unlock each perk on your weapon. This led people to invent special farming routes on each planet to grind for these materials in the most optimal way, and you can even find hundreds of YouTube videos covering the topic. However, there was also another type of material players needed to grind for in order to unlock the legendary and exotic swords in the Taken King. The sword quest required you to get quite a few of a material called Hadium Flakes, and players had to spend hours running around in circles on the Dreadnought until they acquired enough to complete the quest. Depending on the weapons you decided to use, it was incredibly easy to run out of primary ammo back in Destiny 1 and early Destiny 2. These funny-looking white ammo bricks were relatively common, but if you didn't find one for a while, or if you played with a long-range weapon, you could definitely run out of ammo completely. Infinite primary ammo was eventually added to address this issue. One of the most powerful PvP weapons of all time is Gnawing Hunger. It absolutely dominated the Crucible following a massive auto rifle buff in early 2020. It was being used in almost every single game, and people just couldn't find out how to beat it. Luckily though, the sponsor of today's video, Factor, is the perfect solution for defeating Gnawing Hunger. Nobody has the patience and time to spend hours cooking every day, so Factor delivers ready-to-eat meals that are crafted by expert chefs in order to ensure the perfect taste. These are fresh, never frozen meals that you can just microwave in under 2 minutes, and trust me guys, every meal I've had so far has been absolutely delicious. When you have a rapacious appetite, it is unbelievably convenient to just pull one of these out of the fridge because they are fully prepared and create zero mess and zero dishes. And don't worry about the meals getting repetitive, because there are so many different main ingredients to choose from within the 34 unique meal options each week. The number of choices you get is actually wild, and you will never run out of options, even if you want to aim for high protein, low calories, keto, vegetarian, or even vegan. It's time to move on from your old-fashioned way of doing things and eliminate expensive takeout and eliminate the hassle of meal prep. As the gnawing hunger tells us, don't let pride keep you from a good meal. Head to go.factor75.com or use my code POGSDSEP50 for 50% off and free shipping on your first box. There's links below and also a handy QR code that you can scan with your phone. Seriously guys, I promise I'm giving you super good advice here. Go order your first Factor box and use my code. It literally gets you half off. I don't know what else you could ask for. I genuinely love these meals and I'm confident that you will too. By using a consumable called Mote of Light, players could instantly gain experience in order to unlock their weapon and armor perks, massively reducing the barrier to trying out new gear. Engrams used to tell you which slot they were for, so for example, you would know what type of exotic you were about to decrypt before you even turned it in. Another very weird thing though is that you could actually get armor for the wrong class, so people would get pretty frustrated when their hard-earned exotic engram just turned into something for a different class that they rarely played. Destiny used to feature weapons with a variety of scope options that you could change and customize. For example, on your sniper rifle, you might be able to pick from a long, short, and medium range zoom. Over time though, it seems that Bungie has decided to phase these out, and nowadays it's very rare to see a weapon with customizable sights or scopes. Some people love them and some people hate them, but veteran Destiny players will definitely remember the original subclass layouts from both Destiny 1 and early Destiny 2. In D1, we could choose all of these different perks in each column in order to customize our subclasses, and then D2 launched with a very rigid system based on trees. I think we can all agree though, the modern subclass system definitely offers us more customization than either of the previous versions. At the very beginning of D1, 2 exotics were just absurdly overpowered and absolutely dominated the meta. The Suros regime and the Vex Mythoclast were so ridiculous that you basically would stand no chance of beating them if you were unlucky enough to fight them in the Crucible. After Bungie saw the absolute destruction that these weapons were unleashing though, they were pretty fast to issue a nerf to bring these weapons back in line. Prison of Elders was a pretty popular 3-player activity from the House of Wolves expansion. Players would run between different arenas to take on bosses, and anyone who ever set foot in here will definitely remember the iconic intros for some of the different encounters.
The defiled thirsts for your lives.
Modern exotic quests are all relatively easy and straightforward to complete, but this was absolutely not the case way back in the day. The original Thorn quest required you to get a crazy amount of void final blows in the Crucible, but then if you died, it would literally delete some of your progress and set you back considerably. Oh, and also if you were a hunter, you were just kind of out of luck because at the time, hunters did not even have a void subclass. In retrospect, it seems very weird, but in year 1, each class only had 2 subclasses, and the Night Stalker subclass simply did not exist. Over the years, there have been some very famous ways of cheesing various raid boss encounters. It used to be possible to push Atheon off the map by simply throwing grenades, people would unplug their internet in order to glitch Crota into kneeling forever, and it was even possible to despawn all of the enemies on the bridge encounter by simply climbing up to the top of this tower. Something you might have forgotten is that Destiny actually used to limit how often you could sprint. If you tried to sprint too often, there was literally a cooldown that forced you to go slow. Luckily, this was removed and could be addressed with an artifact during Rise of Iron. Throughout the years, there have been some extremely famous hidden quests that are now fondly remembered by the entire community. From the OG Black Spindle to the Outbreak Perfected, these are easily some of the most beloved activities in the history of the franchise. Warlocks used to have a unique ability that ended up breaking the game in quite a few different ways. Players on the Sunsinger subclass could instantly revive themselves after dying, which obviously allowed them to dominate in basically every activity in the whole game. If the entire team went down, it was no big deal, as long as you had a Warlock who could self-res and save the run. PvP players will definitely remember the paranoia of looking at every dead Warlock and wondering if they might suddenly spring back to life. Over the years, the process of infusion has been used to increase the power level of your gear and weapons, but real veteran players will remember that the entire process was a huge hassle back in the day. Not only was infusion rather expensive, but it would only partially level up your gear, and the whole process was so confusing that players literally had to use a calculator in order to figure it out. Back in the really early days though, infusion actually didn't exist, and the raid was the only way to reach max power. This was a pretty big issue because every max level Guardian would be forced to wear the exact same armor from the raid. A huge number of people also got forever stuck at level 29 due to the insane luck required to get every single piece of raid armor and reach level 30. Anyone who played Destiny 1 PvP towards the end of its lifespan definitely remembers the hilarious and depressing sticky grenade meta. These grenades had target acquisition so strong they would literally curve around corners, and they would instantly one-shot everybody. It was probably the lowest skill meta in the history of the franchise. Within the original tower, there used to be these intercom announcements that would echo through the loudspeakers every now and then.
Inbound Kestrel, scans show you have 3 live Cabal on board. Confirm that they are restrained.
There were some particularly funny ones featuring Cayde, but then there was also this other one featuring your mother.
Error. Bungie.net. Satisfying your mom since 1991. Error.
These days, ghost shells are considered purely cosmetic equipment with a few mod slots, but they actually used to have a power level that would influence your overall gear score. Veteran players might also remember that we used to only have one ghost shell option, which really contrasts the hundreds of options we have today. On the second week of Destiny's existence, a monumental event would happen at the tower. But sadly, it seems that about 99% of the player base was completely unaware. The event I'm referring to is Xur selling the Gjallarhorn, which was far and away the most powerful weapon in the entire game. At the time though, most players just scoffed at it and said, why would I waste my strange coins on a heavy weapon that I'll barely even use? I'll save my strange coins and buy a primary weapon next week. As the sheer power of the Gjallarhorn became known in the following months, everyone began to severely regret not picking up the Gjallarhorn way back in week 2. Most Destiny 1 players at some point loaded into the tower and found another player somehow standing all the way on top of one of the vaults. It was very strange to see this for the first time, but eventually the knowledge of how to get there spread among the community. If you did some parkour and then jumped off of these metal beams, you could fly across the whole tower and end up on top of the vaults. This became a favorite pastime whenever players were waiting around for their fire team in the tower. In modern times, we have the luxury of being able to load up a new activity from wherever we want, but in D1 you would actually need to manually return to orbit before you could launch your next activity. If you were at the tower, you couldn't even browse the director without first going to orbit and enduring a painfully long loading screen. Year 1 players will definitely remember the original casting for the Ghost's voice actor. Peter Dinklage took on the role, but he was later replaced and had all of his voice lines deleted in Year 2. An absolute Dinklebot classic though was this line, where his voice was just way too loud for no apparent reason.
A cell from the Prison of Elders. The Archon Priest is still inside.
In D2, of course we have the Hunter Dodge, but in D1 this ability was only available to the Night Stalker subclass in the form of an ability called Shade Step. Speaking of class abilities, these didn't even exist back in Destiny 1. The Loot Cave is perhaps the single most famous thing in Destiny history. Players would sit right here and farm these enemies in the cave in order to collect infinite loot. A detail that many players might not know, however, was that the Loot Cave was actually not the most effective way to farm for loot, and Bungie was well aware of the cave's existence prior to the game's launch. Despite it not being the best way to farm for loot, players still obsessed over it due to it being an insanely easy and mindless way to farm. We talked about paying materials in order to unlock weapon perks, but you would also need to gradually unlock and pay for armor perks as well. This was particularly crazy back in Year 1 when there were actually class-specific materials that you would need to use called Sapphire Wire, Hydronic Essence, and Plasteel Plating. If you know about this next one, you're a truly certified veteran player. Way back in the alpha version of the game, sniper rifles would actually have a hipfire reticle to show you just how inaccurate they were from the hip. This was removed from all future versions of the game after the alpha, so very few players know that this ever existed. Nowadays, it's pretty common for people to lock their gear in order to protect it, but in the past, this was not a feature in the game. Factions used to be a pretty huge part of the game both in D1 and the early days of D2. In D1, they had some pretty meta-defining loot like the Hung Jury and the Wormwood, and also some pretty nice shaders like the nearly all-black Revenant shader. These factions also offered exclusive exotic class items that could be equipped in addition to a regular exotic piece of armor, making your Guardian seem just a little bit more fancy. These exotic class items would also give you a unique spawn-in animation, and since transmat effects didn't exist at the time, this was the only way to give yourself a cool spawning animation. Legendary marks were a D1 currency that became fairly important to the game's economy. Various different activities would reward marks on a weekly cooldown, so it was definitely on a player's checklist to hit those activities and accumulate more marks. In a hilariously archaic system, bounties used to require players to literally return to the physical vendors in order to cash in their bounties and receive their loot. In addition, you could only hold 5 bounties at a time, so players would spend a ridiculous amount of time traveling to and from the tower just to complete the extremely simple task of a bounty. Melees in modern Destiny have a standardized range in order to make them fair, but in D1, each class actually had a unique melee range, which made for some very interesting PvP battles. The Arc Warlock melee in particular had a rather long range, and this clip still vividly stands out in my memory as a good demonstration of just how insane this melee could be. Weapon mods in Vanilla Destiny 2 would grant your weapon +5 power and give elemental weapons the option to change elements. There were no other mods, just the flat +5 bump in power. Also, these mods were consumable, meaning that once you applied a mod, it would disappear forever. Something that was on every player's mind back in September 2014 was, what on earth is behind this huge door in the tower? A few weeks later, the door was opened to reveal this huge courtyard area and the Queen's Wrath event. This event was actually super rewarding and players really enjoyed it, but it only existed for a short time and it has only returned one additional time in all of Destiny's history. Eventually though, this area of the tower was opened up and hosted the Iron Banner. There have been some very strange ammo economies over the years that veterans are sure to remember. Back in D1, sidearms would actually use special ammo, and we also had special weapons that could use primary ammo, like No Land Beyond and Universal Remote. When D2 launched, they moved everything to the power slot, so even legendary snipers and shotguns would require heavy ammo in order to use. Destiny used to have a partial exclusivity deal with Sony back in the day, so there were tons of weapons, exotics, and even entire PvP maps that were completely unavailable to Xbox players. It seems crazy to say this, but stuff as iconic as the Hawkmoon hand cannon was just straight up not available to anyone who happened to play on the Xbox instead of PlayStation. If you pull out your map in modern Destiny, it contains some useful information like how long until the next public event. But in the past, this was somehow not a thing. If you wanted to see when the next public event was, you would literally need to go to a public event website back in Destiny 1. Speaking of which, the entire lore for the game used to exclusively exist on Bungie's website. There was no method of reading any of the lore in the game, and instead you just received this funny little notification on the bottom of your screen telling you to go read things on Bungie.net. When it comes to your Guardian's appearance, things used to be very different than they are now. D1 shaders would apply to all of your armor at once, and it was not even possible to shade your weapons. Certain pieces of armor also came with a chroma slot, allowing players to insert a chroma of their choice and make their Guardian have a radiant glow. These level !?! Knights were the unofficial final boss of the Destiny beta, and due to their insane health and ability to one-shot players, they were very difficult to defeat. A lot of veterans spent hours trying to defeat these guys. There used to be a weekly event where you could put in orders at the gunsmith and have weapons delivered to you the following week. Banshee would also offer a new set of test weapons on Arms Day, allowing players to complete an objective with these weapons in exchange for gunsmith reputation. Certain D1 PvP modes actually contained various vehicles and even turrets that you could use during gameplay. These turrets were kind of massive, and they essentially had 2 sweet businesses mounted on either side of your screen. The perk Final Round used to grant so much bonus damage that it literally allowed snipers to one-shot to the body in PvP. After people caught on to this little trick, everyone just started walking around in trials shooting their opponents in the toes with Aphrodite's Spear. The words April update will hold a special meaning to anyone who played during the Taken King expansion. This update was completely free, but it still basically contained as much content as a really small expansion. Considering that this came in the middle of a pretty long content drought for the game, this update was very popular among the community. Back in the House of Wolves era, it was actually possible to re-roll the perks on your weapons if you didn't like the ones that you were randomly given. This was done through a process called reforging, in which you'd pay a small fee at the gunsmith and then instantly receive your weapon back with brand new perks. Nowadays, there are no actual Guardian levels apart from the Guardian rank system, but for years there was actually a player level. For a while, we had a max level of 40, but this was eventually removed since it didn't really mean much aside from just saying you weren't a total beginner. Xur used to sell some pretty strange things, like glass needles that would let you perform a process called Twist Fate and re-roll the stats on your exotic armor. Xur would also offer these strange sparrow drives that you could use to upgrade your rare sparrows and improve their speed and durability. After completing any activity, the post-game screen used to visually show your rewards and then also the rewards for everyone else within the activity. For whatever reason though, it felt like the player at the very bottom of the leaderboard always got the best loot compared to everybody else. There have been so many different materials over the years, and veteran players might remember some of the classics like the original Ascendant Shards and Ascendant Energy, weapon parts, Radiant Shards, Wormspore, Etheric Light, and armor materials. The perk armor-piercing rounds isn't anything too special nowadays, but in year 1 it would literally allow you to shoot through completely solid walls and just absolutely delete guardians before they could ever see you. When you consider that special ammo was almost unlimited at the time, you can imagine just how powerful this perk was on sniper rifles. There are many beloved shaders from Destiny 1, but a few fan favorites you might remember are Super Black, Glowhue, Revenant, and Chatterwhite. Certain supers used to behave very differently. For example, Fist of Panic, as some of us like to call it, was a single-use super that was basically like a worse version of modern-day Thundercrash. There was also a Nova Bomb variant called Shatter where it would split into 3 different projectiles to reach a very wide area of effect. Sparrowhorns used to be a thing you could equip to your Sparrow, and they had all kinds of unique sounds. These were never brought forward into Destiny 2. Treasure maps were these items sold by Cayde, and they would lead you to special stashes out in the wild. These could reward things like mods, emblems, and random gear. Back in the OG Tower Hangar, there was a jukebox that you could activate to start a dance party with your friends. This one definitely brings back some nostalgia for anyone who would hang out here. Titan mains will definitely remember the amazing Twilight Garrison exotic armor that basically allowed them to dash through the air at incredible speeds. When you pair this with the original Titan skating, it was pretty crazy how fast and mobile Titans were in Destiny 1. The orbit screen hasn't changed a ton over the years, but something about the original D1 orbit screen with its music just feels special if you're a veteran player. Many of us are spoiled nowadays with the advances of modern technology, but something that D1 players might remember is the incredibly long loading times. Especially if you played the game on a PS3 or Xbox 360, it would take ages to load literally everything, and it was very common to get stuck on a black screen for quite a while. I mean, just look at how long this is taking to load the basic character menu. We have come a long way over the past decade. Did you know that you can cast a healing rift while you're in the tower? Well, technically you can, and to find out more about that and a bunch of other interesting information, watch this video covering 20 minutes of facts that are technically useless but also highly entertaining. I hope that you enjoyed this nostalgic trip down memory lane. Subscribe so we can hit 100K, and I'll catch you next time.